Hi, Matt. Welcome to the show. Such an honour to meet you. We've just been chatting for a little bit. Matt, for those of you who don't know, is an absolute storytelling stroke format stroke innovation legend. Used to work for the BBC, for Channel 4, and co-founded an incredible company called Story Things, as well as doing loads of other amazing things. So welcome, Matt. What an honour.
Thank you very much for the invite. Pleasure to be here.
I thought we'd start off just with a brief overview of your many amazing things that you've done so far. I think I was saying I first heard about you when you were the head of innovation at the BBC, which must have been pretty at a very interesting time as well. I think it was sort of at that time when everything started to go digital.
To be honest, I think it's probably the only time in my life when I could have even been considered for a job like that, because it was 2001. And I'd spent, my background's in art. I went to Glasgow School of Art in 1990, which is an amazing time to be in Glasgow. And then did my degree show entirely on Photoshop and macrame and Director, I think, at the time. It might have even been an early version of Premiere. I'm not sure. I can't even remember what the video software was. But basically, I did computer animation for my degree show. But my course was fine art photography, and everyone, there's about 5 or 6 of us we'd all taught each other how to use this little suite of Macs, and we all made computer-based work for our degree shows in 1994. And this guy called Charles Sanderson, who was an artist who was starting to make computer-based work, he was teaching at the time on the photography course, and he said to me, you do realise you're going to get a 2-2 for this? You're not going to get a good mark, because the head of photography at the time was Thomas Joshua Cooper, who does these like big format, like landscape photos that he selenium tones, and he's really old school kind of analog photography. And he just hated all the computer work that we did. So he said, I think your work's really interesting, but he said, you're going to get a terrible degree show mark. And I was a bit annoyed. But actually 1994 was a really good time to be mucking around with computers. So I then worked as a curator for a while, first of all at the Impressions Gallery in York. And I did a lot of digital work there. We got an ISDN line into the building in 1996. And we were part of the Year of Photography in the Moving Image in Yorkshire in 98. And then an organisation in Huddersfield got some money to set up a new media gallery in 98. And so I went across and set that up and kind of did a lot of experiments, including a lot of experiments in mobile phones. We did a bunch of projects with artists using SMS, because we had a lot of technology in the building, but all of the kids outside, the people who were trying to reach in Huddersfield, were all outside with their Nokias. So I kind of said, why don't we start making digital work based on SMS? Because that's where the audience is. So this was about 98. So yeah, very early days of the web and stuff. So I made a bunch of stuff with SMS, and then someone from the BBC came up to talk to us about it, because I was starting to think about mobile in around 2000, 2001. And said, oh, there's this job going. At the end of the conversation, I was like, oh, there's a job going, head of innovation. You should probably apply for it. And I was just like, yeah, why not? And then suddenly I'm a senior manager of the BBC, which I genuinely, I'm not joking. I don't think I'd have got within a hair's breadth of that job, and within a mile of that job at any other time. It's just the fact that I've been working in digital by 2000. I've been working with digital stuff, commissioning digital work for about 5 or 6 years, which wasn't like the case for a lot of people. So yeah, so I got lucky and ended up in a great job at the BBC, which I loved for about 5 or 6 years.
It must have been incredible. And then I was reading how they sort of went next to Channel 4 and working a lot with some of their education content as well. Like, how did you get into this sort of storytelling side of things from the tech side of things? Was it?
Well, I think I've always been interested in storytelling. Like, I was interested in technology because I was just interested and a geek. But actually, a lot of the work we commissioned when I was commissioning for this space up in Yorkshire, I was really interested in the relationship between the public and technology, and the role of storytelling in that. So we did a lot of work with writers, people like Tim Etchells and Forced Entertainment. And I was really interested in how technology created, worked as a kind of new interface between storytellers and audiences. But for me, it's always about that call and response loop. A story is always something which is a kind of relationship between the audience and the storyteller. And actually, for me, digital technologies were really interesting because they kind of made that accessible in ways that it wasn't before. And actually, one long running thread throughout my career has been a lot of research I've done about how we've measured audiences, right from like theatres and opera houses in the 19th century through to mass media in the 20th century and then digital media. I've always been interested in how to measure that kind of feedback loop between audiences and storytellers. So I've always been interested in story. And my interest in technology has really been about, so that when I commissioned all the SMS pieces in Yorkshire, one of them we did was called Speaker's Corner, and we built this giant 60-meter long LED display on the outside of the building. And we said to people, if you send a text message, it will appear on the building. I like this idea that all the messages that were coming up as Nokias would get stuck like flypaper to the building as they kind of flew into the ether. So we kind of made a way of visualizing that. And of course, we had to deal with people trying to get swear words on it. So for the first week or so we went live, we had this brilliant job of like basically battling with the teenagers of Huddersfield to try and like work out, we had a stop list from the get-go that included, we had a great couple of days of basically collating swear words, not just in English, but also, Hindi and Afro-Caribbean and a bunch of other languages that we knew the audiences would use in Huddersfield. But then they started doing things like FU open bracket K, which would obviously look like a swear word, or $HIT. So we just had to add all of these things. So it was like this kind of little battle of attrition between me and the youth of Huddersfield. So that's what I love. I love it when, as a storyteller, you're kind of in this call and response with your audience, and you're trying to understand how they're receiving the stories and how they're engaging with it. And that. So my interest in storytelling has always been there, and I've just been interested in how technology kind of mediates and amplifies that relationship.
And I guess it's, when I look at the stuff that you were doing, it's always this interesting intersection between the world of technology and the world of sort of maybe more traditional broadcasting. And I imagine that must have been very helpful for the companies you were working with, because you probably had this wonderful understanding of how people think, act, and communicate in a digital realm versus sitting maybe in front of their TV traditionally. But how do you
back? It was really frustrating. To be honest, when I look back, because as I said, I kind of ended up at the BBC in a really, really weird way that I don't think would have happened before or after. And then Channel 4 actually headhunted me because they had this budget for 14 to 19-year-old content that was part of their remit, their education department. And at the time, they were making TV shows that were going out in the morning schedule. And a brilliant woman called Janie Walker took over the department and said, are anyone using these programs anymore? These hour-long programs? And teachers were like, no, the days of Wheeling Italian and pressing play on a video were long gone. This is like 2007. And, kids weren't watching them because they were on during term time. So she said, well, maybe we should reach on where they are. And they commissioned some research and said, young people are using their mobile phones and computers. So she made this decision to shift, I think it was about 9 million budget we had a year to, instead of making TV, to make digital content. And so I literally had a phone call, and I didn't really, Channel 4 were kind of doing some stuff digitally at the time, but it was driven very much by their commercial teams. So whereas at the BBC, we've been experimenting a lot with cross-platform stuff, Channel 4 weren't doing a lot yet. So I was a bit skeptical. But then they kind of said, you're going to be in the TV department, which is really important, because the frustration of the BBC is up until this time, like iPlayer was just launching when I left. One of the last things I did was actually run the tender process for the design of it. So because it was hugely controversial, and a friend of mine, Tony Aggie, who was leading iPlayer, knew that it was going to create a lot of tension. And because I was leaving, he said, you can basically take the hit for this because you're out the door anyway. So I ran the tender process for that. And so the only contribution I made to that was I'm responsible for it being black and pink. But basically, the BBC was doing all of that, but new media was still like, it wasn't important. Like, it was not a politically important department in the organization. It was TV and radio and then probably finance, and then new media were kind of like almost like HR. They were like a back office function. And so it was quite frustrating being in the BBC, because a lot of us were saying, this is going to change the way that people consume media, and it's going to be really interesting. There were a lot of people at the BBC that listened, but strategically we weren't really getting anywhere at all. Tom Loosemore probably got more into the heart of the organisation under Mark Thompson's reign than any of us did. I'd never managed to get anywhere politically. So moving to Channel 4 was really interesting, because they said, you're going to be on the TV floor. You're going to be a TV commissioner that's just happening to commission a lot of work digitally. We commissioned a bit of TV in the first year or so. And I brought Alice Taylor with me, who was part of my team at the BBC, who was really into games, because we knew we wanted to experiment with games. So I just had this astonishing, blank sheet of paper and this ability to commission digital stuff, but also to do it from the political heart of the organization, to actually make digital something which was being discussed at the same time as the core kind of TV outputs and stuff like that.
What was the most successful thing you commissioned there, do you think?
The games just went like gangbusters, but we had a real problem. And this is where a lot of my interesting metrics come from, because I kind of came from the digital background where, we had all sorts of data about, hits and visits and users, and we were just overwhelmed by data. And everyone else in telly was like talking about the ratings. And I kind of started digging into how the ratings are measured and was kind of shocked. And I know now that, mathematically the sample size is accurate, but, all British ratings are based off a sample size of about 5,000. So I started digging into the history of the ratings, and that led me down a rabbit hole around Arthur Nielsen, which we can talk about later. I've been trying to ship a book about him for the last couple of years. But we had so much attention for a lot of the projects we did digitally online. We had games that were being played like tens of millions of times. This was the era of flash games in the mid 2000s. So we were doing stuff on like Newgrounds and stuff like that, and getting huge audiences, many of which were global, but a lot of which were still in the UK. But people didn't really know that. Like when we would present if you were part of the commissioning team at Channel 4, there was a regular Thursday meeting where everyone got together and we went through the listings and the ratings, and we talked about what shows had done well and what the competitors were doing. And occasionally me and Alice would go and represent the data we'd get for our projects, and people just wouldn't really get it. I vividly remember it wasn't really until social started that a lot of the TV people started noticing, the impact of digital audiences, because for the first time they could hear the audience. Like up until then, ratings were really the only call and response that they had. Audiences were numbers. Occasionally you would get like qualitative surveys that audience research would do, and everyone would sit down and listen to them. But generally you didn't hear it from the audience. And then suddenly everyone on Twitter was talking about what they were watching on TV that day. And you had this period in the mid 2000s where two-screen TV was interesting, where people were aware that people were sitting at home with, when iPhones got big in the late 2000s, people were sitting at home with their phones and they were kind of on socials talking about it. And I vividly remember the first time someone other than me and Alice was sat in those Thursday meetings and they pulled out their laptop and said, "Look at what people have been saying about a show on Twitter." And I was like, finally, this is like, other people are talking about digital audience behaviors around TV in a way that me and Alice have been immersed in for like the last, 6 or 7 years. But it was slow. It took a long time. And I think ultimately we got a lot of stuff wrong. Like we really thought that audiences would move into more hybrid kind of experiences. And actually what we all know is it's, streaming video was really the thing that everybody wanted. And in a way that's great, because it's actually led to some quite fundamental changes really quite recently, really only in the last couple of years, post-COVID, with the rise of the big streamers, have Channel 4 and BBC and others significantly shifted. We are effectively now in a post-schedule era for broadcast channels. The last .com report was the same as the Nielsen report in the States, in that for the very first time, broadcast scheduled viewing was less than 50% of overall video hours. And that's happened in the UK now, and it's happened in America. And that's been like on the cards. Like that line has been kind of going down for the last 5 or 6 years, but particularly post-COVID, as all the new streaming services launched. So, even a couple of years ago, Alex Mann, who I think is a really brilliant leader at Channel 4, has been saying, I obviously didn't work there when she was there, but I just think she's been really smart. And she said, they are a digital first organization. They commission for, when you used to get a show commissioned at a broadcaster, they would say, "Oh, we think you're a kind of 8 o'clock on a Thursday, or you're a shiny floor Saturday afternoon show." And your show would be expressed in terms of where it's sat in the schedule. Whereas nowadays people say, "Oh, are you a retention or an acquisition show? Are you the kind of show that gets people to sign up to a streaming service? Or are you the kind of show that keeps people paying every month because they're working through a huge, are you a Friends type show?" Or it's weird that Suits right now is like one of the most streamed show because Netflix has bought it accessible. And this wasn't a show that was a huge hit in the UK or even really in the US, but it's now like one of the biggest streamed shows. And that's what you call a retention show. It's like, people just stay with your service because they're watching Friends for the 4th time in a row, or, my daughters have watched Gilmore Girls about 4 times. And then you get acquisition shows, which are the big tentpole shows that get you to sign up to the service in the first place. So the language around broadcasting has shifted. I think we were wrong in the 2000s. We thought it was all going to be about the shift to more kind of hybrid digital broadcast experiences. what it's actually done is fundamentally change the role of the schedule. The one thing that digital has really changed is it's made the schedule less culturally and economically important to broadcasters. And we're just at the tipping point of that right now.
I love that idea of sort of when you're looking at I guess any kind of broad content for your company or brand or whatever. If you look at, what's the content that's going to get them in and make them pay attention, and what's the content that's going to keep them there. I've noticed that lots of the online services seem to be buying live sports now. Like I've seen YouTube buying stuff in the US, and Amazon have been buying, I think, like all the sort of, is it tennis and rugby and lots of other things. Like
they have some football Premier League rights as well.
Yeah, that's pretty bonkers. Like,
so we have a kind of model of how audiences allot their time, because basically we have a whole shtick that we do, which says that we're the schedulers now. Like the big shift since, I think you can kind of split the cultural impact of the web into two eras. The first era, from the kind of late 90s to 2007, turned us all into researchers. Like most of us were not typing a search query into a database like 20 times a day before Google. And so the first era of the web, the skill that we all learned as users was how to search, and that's why SEO became so important, and search engine marketing and all that kind of stuff. And the businesses revolved around this new user behavior, which was searching. And so, if you needed to reach audiences, you needed to understand search, you need to understand the patterns of search, behaviors around search, all that kind of stuff. But the big cultural learning was we all learned to search. Post 2007, when we got these devices in our hands that were like on all the time, we had this new thing, which is that, suddenly the whole day is a media experience. I remember at the BBC in kind of 2002 or 3, when we all had like Nokia phones, very confidently predicting to my boss, Ashley Highfield, that people wouldn't watch video on mobiles because the screens were too small and the network was rubbish. I just said, yeah, people aren't really going to watch video on mobiles. And of course I was utterly and completely wrong. I'm very happy. But if I'd have predicted the iPhone like back then, I'd be a lot richer than I am now, Chris. Yeah. But I totally didn't see that. I didn't see that these devices would end up making every single day a media experience, every single minute of every day a media experience. So basically, what we've all learned to do since 2007 is we've learned to schedule. We've learned to manage our attention and to think during the day about where we want to give our attention. And when we talk about that story things, we kind of say that we talk about this attention pattern spectrum, and really as storytellers, if you were making media and you wanted to reach a mass audience in the 1980s, you kind of had to make something that was between half an hour and 2 hours long. Like most cinema films were about 1.5 hours to 2 hours. TV programs were half an hour, radio programs half an hour, whatever. Even you could say magazines and newspapers were about half-hour experiences. And that's because of the kind of limitations of the distribution mechanisms. The schedule ruled how radio and TV were organized, and they were mainly tied into these chunks. So what's happened since then is effectively two things. We've had these algorithmic streaming platforms that have emerged that have made it possible to monetize much smaller patterns of attention from a couple of seconds through to 5, 15, 20 minutes. So that was YouTube, and then obviously Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, etc., etc. So it's now possible to reach millions of people with micro stories, like really, really small stories. If you were making a story that was 2 minutes long, that wasn't a 30-second ad. If you were trying to make a story and distribute it that was kind of 2 minutes long in 1985, you were probably showing it at a festival. You weren't kind of getting it on the BBC. A friend of mine had a program called Video Nation on BBC Two in the 90s and asked for it to be 5 minutes long. Had to fight really, really hard to get a 5-minute program scheduled because it threw everything else out. But anyway, and equally, if you were making like a kind of 4-hour experience, then that was an art show as well. So two things have happened since digital, kind of particularly the rise of mobile phones and streaming platforms, have kind of expanded the landscape that we have as storytellers to tell stories. We can now design stories that fit into multiple patterns of attention, from a couple of seconds on a streaming platform to kind of traditional scheduled media to serialized experiences where we binge them. And I think, we saw that in our youth audience, the Channel 4, with online gaming. It really annoyed me when I was working at Channel 4 with people saying that digital kind of reduces the attention pattern of teenagers, because we just didn't see it. We saw them playing FIFA or, Call of Duty or something on their Xboxes for like 3 hours at night with their friends. So it wasn't about they didn't have a short attention span. They needed it to be compelling. So anyway, as a storyteller now, you've got this broad experience, and we organize it into 3 slots. We say you've got a content strategy or a storytelling strategy for streams, algorithmic streams, not streaming platforms like Netflix, but algorithmic streams. So, how do you tell these kinds of micro stories, and who are you trying to reach, and what are the pros and cons of reaching them on those platforms? Increasingly now, what are the problematic issues of those platforms like Twitter or X or whatever it is this week? So there's that stream strategy. And then you've got a scheduled strategy, because there are still a lot of attention that is delivered through traditional scheduled media, some through the broadcast schedule, for that less than 50% that still watch scheduled TV, a lot through radio still, and a lot through genres which are still scheduled, like live sport. And then you've got your series strategy, which is what are the kind of high quality, bingeable series that audiences make a distinct decision to say, I'm going to commit to this. I'm going to subscribe to that podcast. I'm going to watch that show on Netflix or Apple Plus or Disney or Discovery or whatever flavor you want. That's where we are choosing what we want to watch and how we schedule our time. So the behaviors you need to understand as a storyteller now are all the way across that spectrum. What are the behaviors around algorithmic streams? What do the platforms let you do? What's the user behaviors? What are the pros and cons of reaching people on that platform? What are the kind of formats and tricks and kinds of techniques you can use to get attention there? What are the strategies around schedules still? Like, what do you need to do if you want to reach people through scheduled media? Is that because it's a genre like sport, which is intrinsically scheduled around a certain time, or is it because you're reaching people through traditional broadcast media or whatever? And then what are your strategies for serial formats? Like, when can you create something which is so valuable that somebody makes an explicit choice to say, I'm going to subscribe to this? And that's where all those subscription, attention, retention kind of metrics come in. So we tend to work more in that space as story things. We do podcasts, we do web video series, we do editorial quarterlies, newsletters. We kind of design for our clients the kind of products that are valuable enough and interesting enough that somebody makes the explicit decision to say, I'm going to subscribe to this. So we kind of build subscription formats for a lot of our clients. But yeah, the sport thing, sorry to come back to it, the reason why a lot of those platforms are buying sport is because it's firmly in their middle bit, and that's really valuable. Like, getting people aligned around event content is still a really, really valuable thing to have.
I remember there was this wonderful phrase I heard you talking about, that you said it was called hammocking. I think it was like an oldish thing where in the past, sort of, if you wanted to get someone to watch something serious, you would hammock it in between 2 exciting programs.
That was a scheduling technique. And I've kind of written about the schedule a lot, because I kind of feel that we've not really ever given this TV schedule the attention it needs as a cultural object. And this is the thing, it's like when I joined the BBC in the early 2000s, like, most of the people I worked around had been working in TV or radio for, that hadn't really changed in its delivery mechanisms or culture or structures. For about 30, 40 years, okay, satellite TV had come along and we'd had more channels, but fundamentally the way in which you made and distributed TV hadn't really changed. The schedule was still the thing. And what really surprised me when I got there is that the real power brokers in those broadcast organizations were the schedulers. It wasn't the senior management, it wasn't the talent, it wasn't the program makers or the channel operators. It was the people who wrote the schedule, because by moving your show from 9 p.m. on a Thursday to 10 p.m. on a Thursday, they could halve the audience. So, they were the kind of people that really understood the black magic of attention and how to kind of organize TV shows in order to get the maximum attention for your show. And yeah, hammocking was one of their techniques. So, and this was really true more in the 70s and 80s before multi-channel and before remotes came in, basically, and multi-channel and satellite TV. So yeah, you would have like Panorama scheduled between, a game show and a comedy, like it would be on before Only Fools and Horses, and, maybe it was Family Fortune, I don't know, whatever it was before. But the idea was that people were couldn't be bothered to switch over in between because they didn't want to miss Only Fools and Horses, so they would watch the show. It, as a kind of strategy for organizing attention, is remarkable, because it's based around inaction. It's based around people just not being bothered to switch over.
I guess it's kind of like the modern day equivalent would be the sort of those annoying little pop-up videos you occasionally get in YouTube when you're watching something you really want, and you kind of they force you to watch it.
It's the same thing that advertising rates were based on for years. What was really fascinating to me was how, as multi-channel TV took over, and there were way more advertising-driven channels, like we went from 2 advertising-driven channels to like hundreds, is TV had to change its grammar to reflect the audience behavior of people switching over in the ad break. So what you got, particularly in like what they call factual entertainment shows, like Grand Designs and stuff like that, is you saw this kind of storytelling approach in which you would be pre-shown at point of jeopardy for the next part of the show. So before the advert break, they would give you a teaser for something that was going to happen because they didn't want you to switch around. And then if you joined after the break, they would give you a recap. So you had this thing where the storytelling became really kind of Byzantine, because you would have like an intro and then something happened, and then there would be a teaser, and then there'd be a recap, and then something else would happen, and a teaser to the next one. So it would kind of be this backwards and forwards all the time in a show. And that was just because people's new behavior in the multi-channel era was switching around in the ad break. You would just be like, oh, this is boring, what else is on? And so if you joined a show at part 2, you needed to explain to the audience what they just missed because you wanted them to stick around. So that structure of the schedule and that user behavior around multi-channel TV and the ad breaks really affected storytelling. And that's the thing that I'm always fascinated by, is how are, in that relationship between user behavior, technology and storytelling, how does that affect the formats and the way in which we structure stories as we discover how these new platforms work?
Nice. And then, a lot of what you've been talking about with this evolution, it always reminds me of that sort of, that idea, I guess, that comes from Marshall McLuhan, which is, we shape our tools and thereafter our tools shape us. What are some of the most recent things that you've been doing in your day-to-day job now, like the biggest shifts that you've been seeing? So now in the last few years, I think there's been, I would imagine, some relatively big shifts. And
I think we are in the middle of a really big shift, and I think it's moving towards a much more balkanized. Like, I think we'll look back. People are already looking back now. If you've read Ben Smith's Traffic book, it's a really good book about the kind of early rise of social. And he worked with Jonah Peretti at BuzzFeed, and then obviously ended up at Semaphore, his new company and stuff like that. And he's been part of that era of companies who really grew big off the back of the big algorithmic platforms, also Facebook and Twitter and all of that. And there was this really weird period. I mean, you're at the beginning of blogging. There was this really weird period of like Web 2.0 creating some unimaginably large scale public spaces that genuinely not even, I was good friends with Clay Shirky in the kind of 2000s and brought him over to talk at Edinburgh TV and, talked to him a lot about all of this. And of course he wrote Here Comes Everybody, like one of the key books of the Web 2.0 era.
Had supper with him as well. Lovely guy.
but the one thing that none of us, what we all got wrong is funny. I went back, a friend of mine started a kind of Web 2.0 book club during lockdown where we all went back and read it. And we read Larry Lessig's Free Culture. And he talks about what, the book Free Culture was not about free as in beer. It was about free as in open. And it was about what happens when people can kind of all participate. And, Clay was obviously all of us were thinking about these same issues. And what's remarkable is how low ball all of our estimates were about scale. Because in the book, Larry Lessig talks about early Wikipedia and early kind of participatory networks online, in which you were talking about a few million users. And then he says, imagine what this would be like where there are 10 million people or 50 million people. And it's like, mate, we got over 1 billion. Like we got into the billion at the end with these platforms. And it's just, we are at the end of a kind of 15-year period from roughly 2007. Because although the platform started in 2005, I mean, when was Facebook? Was that 2004? Twitter was around 2007. I think it was a mobile phone that really amplified their influence on society. They were just perfect for these devices. So we've kind of had this 15-year period in which a huge amount of culture has existed in these giant public platforms. They were obviously all personalized for us in various ways through algorithms, but they were experienced culturally as this kind of mass. And I don't think we're going to have that for the next 10, 15 years. I think we're all moving into niche platforms. I don't think, I mean, TikTok is obviously huge. And I think you're going to see platforms at that scale, but I feel like none of them are going to have quite the cultural importance that they did. I mean, the next US election is going to be really interesting because I've read a couple of reports of people saying people don't quite know where it's going to happen. Like, it's not going to happen on Twitter as much. Is it going to happen on Threads? Like, where is the kind of, or is it going to be bifurcated, across lots of different platforms? And I think we are moving into this era in which there are now, much more differences between the types of spaces we exist in online. To be honest, probably a lot healthier. But one of the things I really loved about that era, particularly on Twitter, which, was my kind of drug of choice. I didn't really ever connect with Facebook a lot, and Instagram I got off quite quickly. But Twitter, I'd finally nuked my account last November, and it felt really good because it was a toxic place. But at its height, it was like this overlapping community, and I would see stuff from people that I would never otherwise have ever met. So part of me feels it's a good thing that we're kind of going to be bifurcated into smaller platforms and more niche networks, because I think that will be generally healthier for public life. But part of me really wonders how we're going to get that serendipitous crossovers happening, because I don't think, that's a necessary thing, and I don't know how we're going to solve that problem. So yeah, I think the big shift now is basically after big social. Like, what does life look like after big social? And I think we're only just beginning to see what that might mean.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, I wonder whether, I don't know whether you've thought about this a lot yourself, but yeah, have you, I was thinking about it earlier when I was prepping for this. It was sort of, in the past, it used to be really hard to make stories in a way, and that you had to have, you had to be able to be commissioned or have a book authored. And then Web 2.0 kind of democratized it a bit more, but it was still like a very sort of, maybe at the very beginning, you had to know a little bit about how to use the web a little bit more. Now you have lots of influencers, but they're still like a very sort of small subset of people. What I'm finding interesting is not necessarily now, but in the next kind of 5 years, it certainly seems that with the way that AI and deep fakes and being able to, amateurs to be able to use these tools to create their own kind of quite high quality, content, anything that pretty much might, the way I'd see it is maybe in 5 years' time, pretty much anything you could dream in your head, without really much expense or huge programming knowledge or any technical real knowledge, you might be able to just make it real by either saying something, typing something, and it just comes up, and the production quality looks pretty amazing. You could, I don't know about the legalities of it, but you could have Tom Cruise starring in your gardening show or whatever it is that you want to make. Have you thought about that kind of side of things at all with the work that you're doing?
Yeah, and in a way, this goes right back to like the work I made as a student at art school on these early Macs. It's like there are two things that digital's done over the last kind of 30, 40, 50 years. One is, revolutionized production, and the other one is revolutionized distribution. And in a way, distribution was the story for those 15 years of big social. The revolution of distribution was by far the biggest impact of digital. I mean, meanwhile, in Hollywood and other places, people were working on, new visual effects technologies, and games actually, were getting incredibly sophisticated in their production, but they weren't reaching the masses in the way that you've just described. The tools that did reach us as a masses were becoming simpler. It was like 160 characters was the maximum we got. So the first era of like the distribution revolution of digital actually happened on very simple forms of production. Like Instagram was probably the most complex. I mean, obviously YouTube, but YouTube didn't really have production tools built in the same way that TikTok did. So I think maybe the next era of digital impact on storytelling is going to be a lot more about production than about distribution. Distribution is going to get harder again, because we are maybe not going to be existing in these platforms which can genuinely gift attention in the way that they have done in the last 15 years. It's already harder to get attention. TikTok is not the same in terms of how you build audiences. You can't really build followers in the way that you traditionally have on other platforms. On TikTok, you can get followers, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to reach them. The algorithm is way more influential in what people see than whether you follow someone or not. So it's much harder to get reach, and I think that's going to get harder. So I think the era of easy reach and easy distribution, which, if you read Traffic and you read Ben Smith's book, how much of that traffic and attention was real is a very good question. There were a lot of big numbers thrown around. There were known outright lies told by Facebook and others about what reach and attention you were getting, particularly in the pivot to video debacle. So, whether those numbers are really real was another question. But I think you're right. I think, one thing that is more interesting over the next 10 years is going to be digital's influence on production rather than digital's influence on distribution.
I love that idea. I was reading you talking about it a while ago as well. This sort of idea that the value exchange has fundamentally shifted. It used to be that it was very clear the social networks value exchange was kind of we'll connect a customer with a brand or with someone who's trying to sell something, or just even people with people. But now it's the platform itself which takes everything and gives very little value to the other two parts. So how are you, with the work that you're doing today, what sorts of things are you looking at or trying that work around that, or help mitigate that problem?
So first of all, I give credit to Cory Doctorow, because it was his phrase "enshittification" that I kind of used, I think, on the Unofficial Partner podcast, and his kind of analysis of that is really strong, because we were both part of that Web 2.0 era, and what everyone got excited about was this idea of two-sided markets, that there are people that want to consume something and people that want to kind of make it, and these open platforms can develop that connects them. And that was the kind of vision of early Web 2.0. What happened then is, the platforms made it easy for people to upload content and easy for people to find it. And then once they'd solved that problem, they said to the people who were making it, hey, if you give us some money, we can make it even easier, and we can make it ratchet up difficulty if you don't pay us. So actually, if you're a brand, pretty much after 2014, I'd say, you were on a paid platform rather than an organic reach platform. You could still get organic reach. I mean, nobody's asked us as a brief to go viral for a very long time, because that's a horrible experience. But also, it's just really technically difficult without buying attention. They became advertising platforms. So as soon as that Facebook realized it was an advertising platform and they could charge the makers to promote their content to users, and then as soon as they realized that they would make more money if they stopped showing users the friends content that nobody, friends weren't going, I was never going to pay my friends, Facebook money to show my content to people that follow me on Twitter, or, Twitter rather. So, the market was to basically suck up all of that power and money in the middle and to basically throttle both sides. And that's what the platforms have done. And that's eventually led to them being less successful products, because users aren't always getting what they thought they were getting when they first turned up on those platforms. And producers are increasingly questioning whether the money they spend on them is actually delivering the results that they want. So that's the enshittification process, where effectively the two-sided market starts as a very open egalitarian idea. And then eventually, as Cory Doctorow says, the kind of value gets sucked up into the owner of the two-sided platform until the whole thing becomes shit and nobody has a good time anymore. Everyone moves on to the next thing. So that's if you haven't read Cory Doctorow's blog post on enshittification, which is a difficult word to say, but it's well worth it. I think what everyone's kind of realizing now is the more you can own that direct relationship, and this is manifesting itself in a number of ways. Obviously, there's a real shift towards first-party data with various kind of rules around privacy. If you have those kind of first-party relationships with users, you're in a much better position financially and legally and responsibly than if not. Apple kind of really cutting off a lot of third-party cookies at the knees has really affected those platforms in a way that personally I think is really positive, although I'm kind of slightly annoyed that it was another big technology company that did it rather than the government. But anyway, but I think, seeing the rise of subscription models, direct relationships with your audience, where people give you a signal saying, I'm not just interested in this, but I value it enough to pay for it or to subscribe to it. They're the signals that we work around when we develop content formats that story things. Is, we're not just interested in reach. We're interested in, there's always two parts to a relationship. One is awareness, and then one is that kind of acquisition point. So we're always interested in how can you work on platforms or distribution technologies that have that additional value point that you can own and take with you. So, we use Substack a lot, predominantly because we can take all of the data with us when we leave. And as soon as they change that, we'll be off that platform, because we did a lot of work on Medium in the late 20-teens, early 2020s. And we had followers, we had like publications, we ran for Gates Foundation, we had like 50,000 subscribers on it. And we couldn't take them with us when we moved. We just had to try and rebuild them all again. So I think for us, we are being a lot more careful about that first party data whenever we do projects for clients or for ourselves. When we think about the technologies we're using, if you cannot really own that direct relationship with the audience through that platform, then ultimately you are going to end up in designing for the platform rather than designing for the user, because they will ratchet up their influence over connecting you to your audience to give themselves more power and income, until it comes to the point that you're really designing for them rather than designing for your audience. And that's never, as a storyteller, that's never a really good position to be.
That's brilliant, priceless advice. Have to look at, be way more careful about where you're putting your content and make sure that you own your data. Substack's a marvellous example. And also reminded me the power of the humble newsletter in a way, to tell your story and to own that conversation a bit.
Yeah, it's really having a moment. And there's a guy called Brian Morrissey that does a brilliant rebooting newsletter who talks about media models. And he's talking about that a lot in terms of B2B and niche. Like, he's really big on this kind of, we are entering a new niche era now. And, trying to build the next BuzzFeed or the next Vice is kind of really hard and probably not what you should be trying to do right now. But if you can have a niche audience and you can own that first party data and you can turn that into something valuable enough for people to pay for it, you can have a really decent business. And he's done a couple of nice analysis of like deep B2B niche plays, which are actually generating like, tens of millions of dollars a year. And they are predominantly driven via newsletters, because that is, one of the most reliable ways to get into, people's attention still. Email kind of comes around again every decade or so, and it feels like it really is at the moment.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I guess it's also worth noting that although a lot of our conversation's been about, I guess talking really about video a lot of the time, storytelling takes place on all different formats. So I imagine a lot of your work is not necessarily
the vast majority is editorial. We the biggest project we do for ADP, the global payroll company, is a quarterly publication that is predominantly delivered by a newsletter that then sends them to a site. And that's like the work we do for a lot of clients is basically how do you move from a campaign model to a format model where you build a format that's valuable enough that people want to give you their attention. You're not trying to reach them via blasting out on a social platform and hoping that they somehow stop scrolling and read your message, but they actively choose to say, I want this. So whether that's a podcast that people subscribe to or a newsletter. And the challenge is that a lot of our clients, particularly the marketing departments, are so geared up towards a campaign, towards identifying a message, maybe around a new product launch, around an event or something like that, getting a media plan together, commissioning the creative, firing it all out, getting the metrics back, and they're saying, great, let's do it all again now for something else. And just like letting the audience disappear again until you kind of run the next campaign. And we've always been like partly maybe because, me and Hugh, the three directors, me, Hugh and Anjali Ramachandran. So me, Hugh Gary and Anjali Ramachandran. Anjali, similar to me, was like, she was head of innovation at Omnicom for a while. So she came through a marketing background, but in an innovation role similar to me in the B. Hugh was at Radio 1 for years doing digital right back from the days of their first websites. So he kind of shares my public media background. But we understand the word formats, because if you work in broadcasting, formats are like gold. Like if you come up with the next TV format, the next game show, the next reality format, you'll make millions of pounds on that because people love formats. And Richard Osman, who is a brilliant format designer, before he appeared on Pointless and started writing mystery books, we used to see him in Channel 4 all the time because A, you couldn't miss him, he's so tall. But secondly, because he worked for one of the Endemol subsidiaries and would always be in pitching new shows. And he's developed loads of formats in his career. And he says the thing about format is it's a bit like something you already know, but slightly different. And that's a really important thing. When we are committing our attention to something, it's easier to do that if it's something a bit like something you already like, but just slightly different. It's very difficult to get people to give their attention to something so new that they have no kind of reference points for it. So if you can kind of make a format that feels a bit like something that they already do and do it, and, you know, but has a twist to it, then that really, really compelling. So a lot of our work with clients is how do we move them from thinking about their comms and their stories in terms of one-off campaigns where they kind of like let the audience dissipate and then try and have to win them back again, to long-running formats that they can invest and grow over time. And most of the time, it's really hard because they're not set up for that. Like the way they're reporting to their bosses, the way their budgets are structured, the way their teams are structured are not right for running a long-running podcast. So you do see lots of people say, oh, we need a podcast, and they'll commission a season of it and it will do all right. And then they just kind of give up on it, or they run a newsletter that kind of peters out after 20, 30 weeks. Because running something long-term is hard, and it's a different cadence and a different way of working. So a lot of the stuff we do with clients is basically teaching the workflow of a long-running format. You know, this is what it takes to run a really good podcast. This is what it takes to run a good web video series. This is what it takes to run a good newsletter, because it's very different from running a campaign. You know, the metrics are different. The audience growth and development is different. You know, you do a lot more community kind of management and engagement than you do with campaigns. But the rewards are you can end up with a really sizable audience of people who really look forward to, like, my measure for engagement is always how many people can't wait until your next episode. Like, you know, how many people have you got that when you drop into their inbox, like we do this Story Things Friday newsletter. And the best thing is when people say to us, I know the weekend started because your newsletter arrives on a Friday afternoon. And it's like, wow, you know, we are the point in somebody's weekly work diary where they're like, great, I can relax now. Story Things newsletter's in. This is the start of the weekend. If you can kind of be a part of somebody's habits, a part of somebody's life like that, that's so more valuable than getting like, you know, 10 million views on a Facebook video, because they have a relationship with you and they have a kind of loyalty to you, and they kind of value you and want to be part of a community around your thing. But a lot of people really struggle with running long running formats because their organizations and their teams aren't set up to work like that. So a lot of the challenge of moving from this kind of era of big social and campaigns built around algorithmic platforms and this kind of niche subscription era, which we're starting to enter into, this post-traffic era where people are more interested in subscription and first-party data and less on just raw traffic data. The really big issue around a lot of that is just workflow. The mediums and the formats are very familiar. You know, podcasts have been around for ages, newsletters have been around for ages, events have been around for ages. You know, these are all kind of known. The challenge is that most people's teams are not set up for managing them.
I guess it's also psychologically we're not used to living very long in the scale of things, so we're often more concerned with the now than what's going to happen in 2 years' time.
I think most people report on too short a timescale to invest in something that goes. We've been working with ADP on the Rethink Quarterly we do for that for 4 years now, and it's really motoring. Like, you know, we've just had to work with them on a big presentation, and you know, they really see the value of it now. But, you know, it's taken us a couple of years to really get that format bedded in and working. And if you're running a long-running format, you know, we mainly say to people, like, if people come to us and say we want to do a podcast, we'll come to them and say, you do realize that you're not going to, you know, it's very hard to get a huge audience out the gate. You're going to have to commit to this for a while to do it, because it takes a while to build an audience around something. And also it takes a while for formats to gel. Like, formats generally need around 6 editions before you kind of understand the structure and the way it works. Because it's part of this call and response. Like, you'll try something and, you know, people won't like one bit of it, or they'll come back and say, oh, why don't you try this? And it's a conversation more, because it's not just this one-off bam campaign. It's like, because you iterate it, people kind of like fit it into their lives in slightly different ways. And if you listen to that, you can kind of learn what bits of your format work. We did some work with Dazed and Confused way back in the day, in the early days of Story Things. And as part of our research, I went and looked at the first kind of dozen issues of Dazed. And the first 3 or 4 just changed radically. And then by the 4th, you could start to see the front page and the order of the magazine kind of starts to get organized. And then by the 6th, it kind of looks like the days that being published now. And then gradually it's kind of like iterated off that. But it generally takes about 6 episodes for you to really get that format right. So yeah, so people just don't have the patience. If your budgets are set quarterly or even annually, if you've invested in something and it's not knocking it out of the park within the first kind of 2 months, then generally people will kill it. And that's often like the worst time to kill a format, because that's the point where you're learning the most. If it's not working, you're learning what's not working. and you've got the opportunity to turn it around and try new things. But if you just kill it, then you just never know.
And it's amazing advice. I know we're running out of time rapidly. So what would be maybe a couple of sort of top tips for formatting today that what are there any sort of formats that you think work particularly well in today's world that people should look at or try and do? And then following on from that, best places to find you apart from storythings.com. I heard you saying you're off Twitter now, so is it best to reach out to you on LinkedIn? Or
So I think we kind of think about attention and formats a lot, and if you're not insanely curious about all the different ways in which your audiences are making decisions about their attention every day, then you don't understand the landscape. It's like being an architect and not doing a survey before you build a building. If you're not really deeply understanding and looking at attention and understanding how attention is changing, and it doesn't change really quickly. Like, it's not like suddenly overnight everyone starts doing something different. A lot of attention patterns are similar across platforms and technologies. It was actually the reason I always picked 2007 is the mobile phone genuinely changed the way we use our attention in a way that just hadn't happened for probably since TV. So it was like, that was a big shift, but those big shifts don't happen a lot. So really understand the kind of general shift. So if you weren't looking at those Ofcom stats and seeing the kind of gradual drop in broadcast viewing, it would have been a real shock that it's gone on to 50%. In actual fact, that line's been going down for 7-8 years. So be intensely curious about your audience and also reflect on your own behavior. I see an awful lot of people in commissioning positions who assume that audiences would do things. And then if you say to them, well, would you have time to do that? Would you kind of find that interesting? And they don't kind of reflect on their own behaviors enough. Like, I'm always reflecting on my own behavior and what I'm paying attention to and what I'm not. And if I find something new, I'm also thinking, why, how did I find that? And why did I find it interesting? And, that value proposition. Nowadays, there's a great line, which is not ours, which I love, which is that audiences don't have short attention spans. They have short consideration spans. In other words, there is so much stuff that we could give our attention to. It's not that we just only look at it for a couple of seconds because we haven't got time to give it our attention. We only look at it for a couple of seconds because it hasn't given us any reason to give it more attention. Like, all of this stuff is flying at us. So if I'm going to watch that new show or subscribe to that new podcast or read that new newsletter and subscribe to it, you've got to make that value proposition really strong, really early. Like, this is why you need this. This is why you need to subscribe to this. And most people don't do that. Most people think they can be a bit more mysterious and let people kind of discover them. Nowadays, you just haven't got that time. You've got to be really clear about what the value proposition. That's why formats are so important, because people will understand a format. Think, oh, it's a bit like that. I get it. Right. Do I want it or not? Whereas if you do something wildly different, then they're going to get confused and probably just not give you their attention. So yeah, really understand attention and really understand how we schedule it, why we make those decisions. And if you're doing that, then understand the role that formats play as heuristics for our attention. Like, we are all every day making decisions. Have I got enough time to subscribe to another newsletter? Have I got enough time to listen to a podcast? I haven't finished The Bear yet. Do I start watching Andor again? Or, what is it? We're all making those heuristics decisions, and formats are great ways to become part of that decision-making process. It's like, oh, I need, I really want to find out about AI. Is there a good newsletter I subscribe to? Is there a good podcast I can subscribe to? That's how we think about our attention nowadays. So understand the role that formats play in that decision-making. So understand attention and understand the way that formats play in that decision-making. So they're the two bits of advice I'll give. If you want to find us, we have a very large audience around our 3 newsletters. So the main Story Things newsletter every Friday, which is nearly all Hugh's work, and Chloe and our team, who are brilliant. So I can't claim any credit for that. We give you 10 stories to read every Friday. Again, it's a really simple proposition, 10 interesting stories about creativity and storytelling and culture. And then we started a couple of years ago, one every fortnight, called Formats Unpacked, which is at formatsunpacked.com. You can also get it through the Story Things website. And that's us trying to teach people about formats. So every fortnight we break down a format that we like. So last week I did one called Not a Newsletter, which is a newsletter about newsletters that actually is a Google Doc. And it's such an interesting format that I had to break it down and find out why the guy decided. So you get a newsletter that literally just links you to a Google Doc, and then you read it as a Google Doc. And it's brilliant. And I got really interested in why I liked it so much. So I kind of unpacked that. So we look at that thing about what is it that makes you give something your attention, and why does the format work in the way that it does. So we've done everything from bargain hunt to books to jokes to, it's a really broad take on formats. And then we've just started a more recent one called Attention Matters, where we're diving more into attention. So we've done a couple of formats on that. We published some research at the beginning. Then I did a short series about metrics. So I did one on likes, views, followers and shares, kind of looking at those metrics and trying to unpacking them culturally. And now we're just doing a short series where we're interviewing people who run publications or newsletters or whatever. And we ask them, what do you want to know about your audience? So it's like 5 things I wish I knew about my audience. So we're doing that. And then there's a new format that we're going to be launching in the next month or so. So we've got Attention Matters. If you want to follow us about our attention research, formats unpacked, if you want to learn more about formats, and the Story Things newsletter, if you just want to get 10 nice stories in your inbox at the beginning of your weekend.
Your newsletters are definitely absolutely incredibly amazing. It's actually how I was put onto you in the first place.
Excellent.
A bunch of our team were like, got to chat to Matt. Their newsletters are amazing. Thank you so much for that. And really, really appreciate your time. And also thank you for bringing us, the iPlayer. That's been a pretty big thing in a lot of people's lives in the UK. Big fan of that, and all your incredible storytelling work. Long may it remain, and good luck in finding lots of amazing new formats as well. I really appreciate the time, Matt.
Well, thank you so much, mate. It's been great fun. Really enjoyed our chat. Thanks a lot, Chris.
Cheers.